Welcome to A Spin on Offshore Wind, the podcast brought to you by Energy Coast, North East England's offshore wind cluster. This is the first in a new series of podcasts with me, Caroline Lofthouse, where I'll bring you industry insights, project updates, news from the UK's leading region for offshore wind, and of course, further afield. Don't forget to subscribe so each episode drops into your chosen podcast app, or find it on energycoast.co.uk. To kick things off, I thought it would be great to chat with one of the leading figures in offshore wind, who is also the Chair of Energi Coast. It's Tony Quinn. With more than 40 years of experience in the power generation industry, Tony is Test and Validation Director at the ORE Catapult, which has its National Renewable Energy Centre in Blyth in Northumberland. Hello Tony, thanks for joining me.
Hi Caroline, delighted to be with you today.
Excellent, thanks Tony. So what I thought I would do is to set the scene. I thought we'd have a bit of a conversation about why you think North East England has become so integral to the offshore wind industry.
Well, that's a great question to start with, Caroline. I think what sets us apart initially as market leaders is the fact that we've got so many wind farms pretty much on our notional doorstep, and particularly with having the world's largest offshore wind farm in Dogger Bank currently under development and soon to be moving into deployment. And I think having that market pull for our engineering services in the Northeast is absolutely fundamental to our development.
And kind of thinking about our sort of history, oil and gas, shipbuilding, what's your kind of thoughts in terms of sort of those areas for offshore wind, and how have they helped us to build such a great supply chain?
Yeah, I think what you're driving at there, Caroline, is our industrial heritage, and you can trace it back even before oil and gas, I would say, into the days of coal, when we were really heavily fossil fuel dependent for all of our energy needs. And I think that's where the industrial heritage of the Northeast was truly established. And we never really lost that. We transferred that knowledge into, as you've mentioned, into oil and gas. And I think that's given us world-leading expertise, particularly in subsea engineering, which is really important to this now energy transition. And now what we're seeing is those companies use their skills that they've developed over many years into the renewables industry. And I think it's really, really fantastic to observe. And it's that gives us the building blocks for the supply chain to become even bigger and better.
And I know in terms of sort of the geography, could you give us a kind of an overview of where, the region is located and why that is so important for, the not just the UK offshore wind sector, but the global offshore wind sector?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm really passionate about the fact that we derive USPs that are really important on a global stage, not just on a local stage. And this is the challenge that I think the capacity, both in the UK, in Europe, and indeed globally, this drive towards net zero is creating a phenomenal opportunity for the Northeast. And like I say, I think we've got this first mover advantage because we're experiencing all of the challenges of deploying at scale, probably before anybody else in the world. And then how do you use that knowledge to create export capability? And I certainly think we're starting to see that. I think one of our leading companies in the Northeast, SMD, who've made this transition from oil and gas and into renewables, have been involved with something like 70% of Europe's offshore wind farms. And it's that type of capability that I'd like to see more and more of from our supply chain in the Northeast, creating long-term and sustainable value.
I mean, the region has formed quite a strong cluster of companies that are active in offshore wind. You've just mentioned SMD there. Could you tell us a little bit about the supply chain strengths in the region, sort of the links to academia, and how Energi Coast as a cluster support those supply chain companies?
Well, I think one of the one of the real strengths of our cluster is that we've got a real strong cross-section right across the value chain from owner-operators, who are participating in Energy Coast. It's really, really fantastic to have Equinor, SSE, RWE, all, I guess, operating at the top of the pyramid as owner-operators of these large wind farms. And then Tier 1 suppliers locating in our region too, with GE and Equinor setting up their O&M base on the Tyne, Van Oord, based in Stokesley. And then further down the chain, we've got some really, really well-established Tier 2 suppliers in JDR and cable manufacture, subsea engineering expertise I've already mentioned, SMD, but Modus, and that engineering capability from companies like Wilson Engineering, Smulders, Osbit, IHC, right down to really agile SMEs. And it's great to have those agile SMEs part of our cluster too, like MJR Control or Unisys, who are branching out into data. Right through, as you mentioned, to academia. I think we've got some of the strongest universities in the UK, right in our region, all actively participating in our cluster. Durham University, Teesside University, Newcastle and Northumbria. Having this academic strength behind us is really, really valuable, because many people have heard me speak before and talk about the importance of innovation, and having that intellectual power in our region gives real strength and depth to our cluster. And the role that Energy Coast plays is bringing all of those parties together so that we can share information, share intelligence, and collaborate to the benefit of individual companies, but more importantly, to the benefit of the region.
And how does all of that link to what the ORE Catapult do as an organisation, Tony?
Well, perhaps that was a little remiss of me to forget to mention my own organisation there, Caroline. So I'm really, really passionate about the importance of research and innovation in this landscape, because innovation is what gives any cluster competitive advantage in a global marketplace. You need to continue to innovate in both product and process, and that continuously drive for improvement is what will ultimately give us a competitive advantage, as I mentioned, in this global marketplace. So the Catapult really has been established to help organizations bring their products to market in a shorter period of time, to accelerate that product development, to make sure the time from an idea to commercialization is as short as possible. And in that way, I like to think that we work not only with existing companies in the region, through supply chain support programs or initiatives run by the combined authorities, and it's great to have the combined authorities as part of our cluster too, Tees Valley Combined Authority and the Northeast LEP, who are keen to see business support programs through innovation. But also we're keen to work with DIT and try and bring inward investors into our region and help them with their product development too. And in that way, we anchor long-term value for the region because we've got this deep-rooted expertise.
And you mentioned Dogger Bank previously. Could you give us a bit of an overview of the fantastic projects, the offshore wind projects that we have got in the region?
Yeah, well, Dogger Bank is probably one of the main pulls, but of course we've got RWE's Sophia project too, and I guess there are got pretty good proximity to both the Humber region and Scotland too. And one of my, I guess my office overlooks the North Sea, and one of my proudest sort of moments is seeing Smulders shipping jackets up to the Beatrice and Scottish projects, so this proximity to the North Sea is really, really important to our development, because that provides the demand for our services and the pull. And I guess what we're seeing, particularly through the government's energy security strategy, which was recently published, is a drive towards 50 gigawatts by 2030, which is an enormous target, but it will, through these increased projects, will provide even greater demand for the services that we provide.
You mentioned sort of export markets a little bit earlier as well. Where has North East England's capabilities, where have we been actually deploying our products and services in the global industry? What kind of markets?
So I think the sort of buoyant markets at the moment are both the US and the Far East, and I think some of our organisations have been really successful in getting their services anchored in both, and indeed from our perspective, we've had real strong engagement with both the US and countries like Taiwan, who are making this initial steps into offshore wind, seeking advice from both a regulatory regime and the sort of government support that may be needed to kick something off. And I'm saying, I know Energy Coast has been present at a lot of these international trade fairs, and it's great to see, and that encouraging that degree of trade internationally.
And what are your sort of, you touched on the UK sector deal there, and you've talked a little bit about ScotWind. What are your sort of thoughts for the future of offshore wind in the short term, long term, and what that means for British industry and the UK supply chain?
I think the energy security strategy, which was recently published, and you mentioned the outcome of ScotWind, which was far bigger and far more ambitious than I think anybody had initially envisaged. It's probably placing quite a lot of challenges to the existing regime. So I think there are constraints in consenting these sites. I think there are constraints around grid connection, but most importantly to this conversation are the constraints around the supply chain, and can we mobilize quickly enough to take advantage of the scale of ambition. The recently published energy security strategy, there was a lot of publicity around, I guess, the drive towards more nuclear power stations, but we shouldn't forget that they added 10 gigawatts under the 2030 target for offshore wind, and offshore wind remains the real backbone of our drive to decarbonize the electricity system. And that I think will put stresses and strains into the supply chain. And I think what we need to see is greater collaboration or alliancing between projects so that we can work out the cumulative impact from a consenting perspective more effectively. I think that will require better use of data, better use of subsea surveying vessels, which again we're well placed in the northeast to take advantage of. I think we need a better grid connection, probably some form of offshore grid before bringing this power ashore, and hopefully, our indigenous cable manufacturers will be able to take advantage of that. I think we'll see a greater drive towards HVDC. And in the supply chain, I think we probably need to see greater either vertical or horizontal integration of the supply chain, and as I mentioned, either collaborate or alliancing to combine the collective strengths in order to meet this demand, because I think there is a risk that it just simply places too much stress and strain on single organizations. And I think we've got to come together collectively to meet that challenge. And I think that's what one of the great strengths of Energy Coast is, that it provides that forum for us to get together, exchange information, exchange intelligence, and decide how we're going to meet that challenge.
And in terms of the areas that you've just mentioned there, how do you feel that North East England's offshore wind supply chain is placed to play a part in, really activating all those areas that you've just talked about, Tony?
I think that brings us full circle to where we started from, Caroline. I think we're probably more advanced than any other region in the UK and therefore, how do you build upon that success? I think the capacity that is being mooted in terms of offshore wind deployment, there's enough capacity there for everyone to benefit. So I'm not saying that it should be the Northeast to the exclusion of everyone else, but I do think we've got a head start because of that industrial heritage, because of our expertise in subsea engineering. And I think when I look at other areas, not only within the UK, within Europe, they're starting from a much more of a standing start than we are. And I think our challenge is to make sure that we don't let this opportunity pass us by.
Yeah, definitely. Totally with you there, Tony. Could you give us a very quick overview of what Energi Coast is?
So I guess, Energi Coast is a coming together of all of the companies and organizations involved in offshore wind in some shape or form. And it includes the tier one companies, the top of the pyramid, the owner-operators like Equinor, SSE, RWE. It includes the tier one suppliers. It includes SMEs. It includes academia and university. It includes the LEPs and combined authorities. It includes all of the ports in the region. So a real cross-section of the value chain required to deliver offshore wind. It's not a membership organization per se. It represents all of those organizations involved in offshore wind in some shape or form, but we do have a steering group of core membership. And we've got three pillars in terms of our industrial strategy, I would say, based around innovation. I've mentioned the importance of innovation. The skills, because, of course, making sure that we've got a workforce of sufficient competency and capacity to meet the needs of the companies that we're talking about is really, really important. So I'm delighted to have that led by combination of Northeast LEP and Newcastle College. The innovation, by the way, led by Durham University and Simon Hogg. And also making sure that we've got a sustainable supply chain. And I'm really delighted to have some real titans of offshore wind based in our region to bring their knowledge and capability to bear in Energi Coast.
I like that phrase, titans of offshore wind. I'm going to steal that one from you, Tony. So it's mine now. Well, I think that's absolutely fantastic, the insights that you've given us, and I'd like to thank you for your time today, Tony. It's certainly an exciting time for offshore wind and North East England, and we'll be delving deeper into different areas of industry in this series of podcasts. Don't forget you can subscribe to A Spin on Offshore Wind on all good podcast platforms, or you can find it on energicoast.co.uk. That's ENERGI Coast, all one word, .co.uk. Join us next time for A Spin on Offshore Wind.